imagination. The sea invaded my senses. That sense of invasion has just come back to me. And was part of my imagination, whether I was awake or asleep. And as a family, we would comment when the sea was like glass, or we admired and feared it when it raged, or when lightning and thunder lit up the bay against a dark, brooding sky. And I, at least, nurtured a sense of unease at the sea's unknown depths and what might be lurking beneath. And we knew it was a clear day if we could just about make out a distant headland penciled against the horizon. But whether there was fog or it was a clear night, one thing stood out in the darkness for me: the light from a distant lighthouse. In my bed, I would lie and look out and count and anticipate the flashes. But whatever else could be seen, whatever the weather, it was always there. It defined the horizon for me, a light clear for all to see at the furthermost reaches of my sight and my awareness. For me, there was nothing beyond it. Though, of course, I couldn't actually see the lighthouse itself or the rock upon which it stood, just this light in the darkness. Today's readings are tough. They're hard, uncompromising readings. They speak of living out our faith in a world of conflict, suffering, violence, and insecurity. The gospel opens with Jesus' family attempting what might be called an intervention. We don't know exactly what Jesus was up to in that very crowded house, but it's pretty likely he was engaged in exorcism, the casting out of evil, and his family is not impressed. Perhaps they're embarrassed. The teachers of the law, on the other hand, are clearly a bit too impressed. This man seems to possess a power over evil. So therefore, they argue, the power itself must be demonic. And so we have Jesus asserting his authority and pointing out a simple fact: a kingdom divided against itself cannot stand, and therefore his power, by contrast, comes from God. It's a sharp-edged passage, an uncomfortable passage. It draws clear distinctions between the power of God and that of evil, between single-minded devotion to God's will and the household or family of believers, and the ties of family. And it presents us with this really striking and frankly quite curious image of Jesus as a robber, as someone who breaks in to a house, to the house of worldly power, overcomes evil and plunders, steals, or perhaps liberates its contents. It's uncompromising stuff. And it suggests that Christians operate in a world of conflict, darkness, confusion, where difficult choices have to be made between the family of God and one's own family, between security and danger. And in the midst of those difficult choices, we're guided by a vision, by the light of God's will, shining through the darkness of a violent and disturbed world. And the passage from 2 Corinthians, but by the way, 2 Corinthians is a difficult letter, in case you've had to have a little go at it. It's really not easy. And it's a curious letter in all sorts of ways, but it has some strong, challenging language within it. And today we have this remarkable set of contrasts. The wasting away of the outer nature and the renewal of the inner. This contrast between the seen and the unseen, the temporary and the eternal. And then critically, the earthly tent, our bodies, to which most of us are pretty attached, and the eternal house in heaven. And then there's this wonderful expression, which I just love from Paul. He says this, for this slight, momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all measure. Slight, momentary affliction, eternal weight of glory. Paul is drawing a contrast between this world and its challenges, the slight momentary affliction, and the coming kingdom of justice and peace, that eternal weight of glory. And he says the two, if you put them in the balance, simply can't be compared. The latter is so much greater than the former. And yet it's worth clocking the sort of thing that Paul is talking about when he speaks of this slight momentary affliction. And it's there a few chapters on in 2 Corinthians in chapter 11, where he spells it out. Paul occasionally goes on, so I won't go and say everything that Paul has to say, but it goes like this. 5 times I've received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I received a stoning. 3 times I was shipwrecked. For a night and a day, I was adrift at sea. And that's just the beginning of a catalogue of slight, momentary afflictions. What Paul describes is, of course, quite extreme. But the reality for many Christians and others today is very similar. That the strong man rules, and that violence, uncertainty, exploitation, discrimination bring a precariousness to life. That the usual context in which the people of God have been and continue to be called to bless the earth and love their neighbour is this sort of context. To live faithfully in Christ, says Jesus and Paul, is then to make a radical choice with consequences, to stand in opposition to the powers of this world, to plunder the strong man and liberate, to denounce and call out evil in a confused and dark world. As many of you will know, from time to time, my day job at USPG brings me into contact with Christians and communities in the majority world who know quite a lot about the brutal reality I'm describing in their everyday lives. A couple of weeks ago, I was on a call with church members from the Philippines, and they have something called their Abundant Life program. And that program is all about standing in solidarity with the marginalized, standing up for the rights of those who are being abused. In particular, standing in solidarity with the indigenous peoples of the southern part of that country, Mindanao. And I had the pleasure of listening to a highly articulate young woman, Teacher Rose. I would guess she was in her late 20s. She's part of a network called Save Our Schools. And she was talking about the harassment of the indigenous communities, of the 178 schools that have been forcibly closed down by paramilitary groups, of the removal, you could say kidnapping, of indigenous children from classrooms on the pretext that they were being taught or influenced by terrorists. Such attacks are part of a broader attempt to remove indigenous peoples from their traditional lands, to facilitate mining and other extractive activities. And indeed, as part of an excellent presentation, Teacher Rose showed us a posting which labelled her, with her picture, as a terrorist. Yet, despite the palpable threat to her own life, as to many indigenous activists and members of the church, many have been assassinated in the last few years, she remained completely committed to her calling as a teacher, completely committed to speaking out on behalf of others. Jesus' family might have said, "You're out of your mind." It's quite possible that members of her own family say to her, "You're out of your mind. Why do you speak? Why do you speak out and put yourself in danger?" And yet she and others do not lose heart. On the contrary, these are individuals full of life, abundant with life, full of joy, and quite determined to continue to plunder the strong man, to stand up and liberate others. There are many Christians across the world in parallel situations who have really acute, direct, and immediate experience of these temporary, momentary afflictions associated with living in this earthly tent. Yet they live towards, with a strong sense of the vision of the eternal weight of glory. Suffering and joy go hand in such a lived faith. It is, of course, always a privilege and deeply humbling for me just to catch small glimpses of the lives of those living with such courage and conviction. The contrast with the security, privilege, and comfort I enjoy disturbs me, as it should. And yet, despite the difference in experience, we are sisters and brothers in Christ. We are united with them. And we're united because of that horizon. As Christians, we live towards a horizon of being that goes beyond the earthly tent which we inhabit, which goes beyond our mortal lives. We are not condemned to live our lives as if we were the heroes of our own story. Instead, we live with this further horizon. We live with a more expansive and abundant sense of what life might mean. We are called to participate one with another in the genuinely abundant life of the kingdom, of that further horizon which celebrates heaven and earth. United through the fog and the tempests and confusions of the sea of life, with its threatening depths, its great expanses. We are united if we keep our eyes on that clear, defining, drawing light and vision, because it gives us, amongst other things, a much better understanding and perspective on who we really are, as creatures dependent upon our Creator. Together in Christ, we are bearers of an eternal weight of glory. Amen. So let us stand and affirm our faith in the God of life. Let us declare our faith in God. We believe